Everyone told you electric vehicles were the future. Every magazine cover, every corporate earnings call, every government press release said the same thing. The transition was inevitable, the momentum unstoppable, and if you weren't buying an EV, you were simply behind the times. Here is what they did not tell you. In September 2025, AAA published its annual Your Driving Costs report. The study it has been running for over 70 years, and for the first time in the entire history of that study, electric vehicles came out more expensive than gas-powered vehicles in every single vehicle category examined. Not one category. Not two. Every category. Medium sedans, compact SUVs, medium SUVs, pickup trucks. Across the board, owning a new EV costs you more than owning a comparable gas car. And that finding arrived at almost exactly the same moment that the federal government quietly pulled the pin on the $7,500 EV tax credit. What happened next is one of the most dramatic collapses in American automotive market history. And the people who built the narrative around electric vehicles do not want to talk about it. The story you were sold about electric cars had a very specific structure. Lower fuel costs mean you save money over time. EVs have fewer moving parts, so maintenance is cheaper. The technology is improving, so prices will come down. Give it a few years, and it all makes sense financially. That story was coherent, and it was backed by real data. For a while, what it depended on, without ever quite saying so, was a $7,500 subsidy quietly sitting underneath the math, like a foundation no one pointed to. Remove that foundation, and the entire financial argument for buying a new EV in 2026 does not just weaken, it inverts. The question you need to sit with for the next few minutes is this: were you being given honest information about what EVs actually cost, or were you being given the math that worked only as long as the government was paying for a significant portion of your car? To understand how we got here, you have to understand what the EV market actually looked like at its peak, because the peak is the part of the story that is most instructive. In the third quarter of 2025, American consumers rushed to buy electric vehicles before the federal tax credit expired at the end of September. The result was a buying frenzy. EV market share hit 10.6% of all new vehicle sales in Q3 2025, a number the industry had never seen before, a number that prompted breathless coverage about the EV transition finally arriving. Dealers were moving inventory. Automakers were announcing expanded production. The momentum looked real. Then October 1st arrived. The $7,500 federal EV tax credit was gone, and what followed was not a slowdown. It was a cliff. In Q4 2025, EV sales plunged 46% compared to Q3, and 36% compared to the same quarter the prior year. Market share collapsed from that 10.6% peak down to 5.8% in a single quarter. Cox Automotive, which tracks this data through its Kelley Blue Book division, reported that Q4 2025 sales were at the lowest point since Q4 2022, effectively erasing 3 years of market growth in 90 days. Then Q1 2026 arrived, and the damage continued. New electric vehicle sales came in at 216,399 units, down 27% year-over-year from 296,304 units in Q1 2025. The market share held at 5.8%, exactly where it landed after the cliff, well below that historic peak. The EV market had been set back to late 2022 levels, and it got there in roughly 6 months. That is not a market correction. That is a market telling you something about what the underlying demand actually was. When an entire market segment loses nearly half its share in 2 quarters, the industry notices. And the response from the manufacturers themselves is more revealing than any sales figure. Ford ended production of the all-electric F-150 Lightning entirely in December 2025, less than 4 years after its launch, and announced the next generation will return as an extended-range hybrid with a gasoline engine on board. Read that sentence again. The flagship electric pickup from America's #2 automaker, the vehicle marketed for years as the future of the truck, is being replaced by a hybrid with a gas engine. Ford took a $19.5 billion write-down to make that decision official. GM took a $6 billion write-down in the fourth quarter of 2025, with $4.2 billion of that going directly to supplier settlements, payments to companies that had expanded their factories and signed long-term contracts based on GM's earlier production projections that turned out to be wildly unrealistic. GM idled 2 of its Ultium Cells battery plants for 6 months and indefinitely laid off more than 1,200 workers at its Factory Zero EV-only plant in Detroit. The company had already abandoned its previous goal of building 400,000 EVs through mid-2024. And Stellantis took a €22.2 billion charge, approximately $26.2 billion, in the second half of 2025, the single largest EV-related write-down in automotive history at the time of its announcement. The charge formally canceled the Ram 1500 battery electric pickup before it ever reached dealers, included impairment charges of €5.7 billion specifically on EV platforms in North America, and triggered a 25% collapse in Stellantis stock on the day it was announced. The combined EV-related write-downs across Ford, GM, and Stellantis now exceed $53 billion. Industry-wide, the total has crossed $55 billion. Companies do not write down $55 billion because they believe they made the right strategic call and just need to be patient. They write down $55 billion because the math stopped working and they need to tell their shareholders the truth. The manufacturers who are quietly gaining ground in this environment are not the ones who went all in on full battery electric. They are the ones who hedged. Cadillac, Lexus, and Toyota all posted year-over-year EV sales growth in Q1 2026, and the reason they were able to do that is that Toyota in particular built its strategy around hybrids rather than full battery electric vehicles. Toyota has been the industry's most aggressive skeptic about the pace of full EV adoption, and right now that skepticism looks like foresight. The electrification growth happening in the American market is being driven almost entirely by hybrids, not battery electric vehicles. Now here is the part that should make you stop and recalculate everything you thought you knew about the cost of owning an electric car. AAA has been publishing its Your Driving Costs report since 1950. It is one of the most methodologically consistent long-running studies in the American automotive industry. The methodology takes 5 top-selling models in each vehicle category, calculates ownership costs across fuel, maintenance, insurance, registration, depreciation, and finance charges, and averages them over 5 years and 75,000 miles. When AAA's report says something clearly and unambiguously, it is not a headline number designed to generate clicks. It is the product of a rigorous comparison methodology that has been refined for over 7 decades. In September 2025, that report said something it had never said before. EVs are now more expensive to own overall than gas-powered vehicles in every vehicle category analyzed. Medium sedan, compact SUV, medium SUV, pickup truck. In all 4, when you add up every cost over 5 years and 75,000 miles, the electric version costs more than the gas version. Greg Brannon, AAA's Director of Automotive Research, put it plainly: consumers should factor in all the expenses involved before making any commitments. That is the careful language of a researcher who has just found a result that contradicts the dominant market narrative and is choosing his words accordingly. What the data underneath that careful language is saying is considerably less careful. The mechanism driving that finding is not mysterious, and this is where the financial story of EV ownership gets technically specific in a way that most coverage skips past. The primary driver of total ownership cost in any vehicle is depreciation. AAA's methodology confirms this explicitly. Depreciation is the most significant cost of vehicle ownership. And EVs depreciate faster than gas vehicles, significantly faster, for reasons that are specific to how these products are built and how the market prices their future value. The moment you drive a new EV off the lot, the residual value calculation that a lender or a lease company runs on that vehicle is doing something that does not happen with a comparable gas car. It is discounting the battery. It is pricing in the uncertainty around battery replacement. It is pricing in the speed at which EV technology is improving, which paradoxically makes last year's model worth less faster than a gas vehicle of comparable vintage. A gas engine from 5 years ago still does what a gas engine is supposed to do, without meaningful obsolescence. An EV battery from 5 years ago sits in a market where range and charging speed have improved substantially, and the battery itself has been cycling through thousands of charge and discharge cycles, each one reducing its capacity by a fraction of a percent. That degradation is measurable, it is documented, and the resale market prices it aggressively. Austin Shivers, lead automotive engineer at AAA, explained it directly. EV purchase prices tend to be higher than similar models of gas vehicles, which makes insurance, fees, and financing costs higher, and they depreciate at a higher rate than gas vehicles overall, though depreciation can be very specific to a vehicle model. That last qualifier is important. Some EVs hold value better than others, but as a category, on average, across the models that AAA studied, the depreciation story is unfavorable, and it is unfavorable by enough to overwhelm the fuel savings that every EV advertisement leads with. And here is where the AAA data delivers a result that should permanently recalibrate how you think about EV ownership economics. EVs do save money on fuel. Nobody is disputing that. The charging cost per mile is lower than the fuel cost per mile for a gas vehicle. But in 2025, that advantage narrowed in both directions simultaneously. Gasoline prices fell, with the average price for study vehicles dropping to $3.15 per gallon, down from $3.54 the prior year. At the same time, electricity prices rose, with the national average rate for EV charging reaching 16.7 cents per kilowatt-hour in 2025, up from 15.9 cents in 2024. The fuel savings advantage of EVs compressed exactly at the moment when the depreciation penalty was becoming more visible. The result is that EVs still offer fuel savings that amount to less than half of what gas vehicle drivers pay per mile in fuel. But that fuel saving, which is the headline number in every EV advertisement, is not enough to offset the higher depreciation, higher insurance premiums driven by higher purchase prices, higher financing costs, and higher fees that come with a more expensive vehicle. The total cost of ownership calculation, done honestly over 5 years, goes against EVs in every category AAA examined. This is the central point, and it is worth stating precisely. The EV value proposition was never primarily about being a better financial deal. It was subsidized into being a competitive financial deal, and the subsidy did enough of the heavy lifting that the underlying cost structure remained hidden. The $7,500 federal tax credit was not a bonus for buyers who did their research. It was load-bearing infrastructure for the entire market segment's financial viability, and removing it revealed the actual economics beneath. The inventory situation confirms this reading. New EV inventory ballooned to 130 days of supply in early 2026, 46% higher than the 89 days of supply for comparable combustion vehicles. Inventory levels have since come down, but the only reason they came down is that manufacturers throttled back production sharply to match a collapse in demand they had not anticipated. Bringing supply in line with reality is not the same as the market recovering. It is the same as the production side being forcibly shrunk to meet a much smaller demand side. When dealers have too much product relative to buyer demand, that is not a sign of a healthy market with a temporary softness. That is a sign of structural oversupply, which in turn drives the aggressive incentives and price cuts that multiple manufacturers have deployed in Q1 2026 just to move product. Hyundai slashed the price of its Ioniq 5 by nearly $10,000. The average EV transaction price fell to around $55,300 in February 2026, narrowing the gap with gas cars to a record low, but the gap still exists. The depreciation clock still starts on day one, and the insurance premium on a $55,000 vehicle is still calculated on a $55,000 vehicle. Tesla, the company whose name became synonymous with the EV revolution, is now in its third consecutive year of Q1 sales declines. Cox Automotive estimates Tesla sold 117,300 vehicles in the United States in Q1 2026, an 8.4% year-over-year decline, and the lowest quarterly sales level for the company since late 2021. Tesla still commands more than half of all EV sales in the country because the rest of the market contracted even harder than Tesla did. Audi's EV sales fell nearly 90% year-over-year in Q1. Honda fell 65%. Kia was down nearly 40%. These are not the numbers of a market in a temporary dip. These are the numbers of a market that lost its economic rationale when the subsidy structure that funded it was removed. The people who bought EVs in the last 2 or 3 years are living with the consequence of this right now. The depreciation that looked manageable when the $7,500 credit offset your purchase price is now fully visible in your vehicle's market value. The charging infrastructure that was promised as rapidly improving exists but remains uneven, and the electricity rate you are paying per kilowatt hour has been moving in the wrong direction. If you need a major battery repair outside your warranty window, you are looking at a cost that can run into the tens of thousands of dollars on some models. The repair ecosystem for EVs is concentrated. The parts supply chains are thin on older models, and the right-to-repair issues that define this channel's coverage of modern products are acutely present in the EV market. Software-locked systems, dealer-exclusive diagnostics, and battery packs that are designed as sealed units rather than serviceable components. None of this means electric vehicles are a failed technology. The technology works. The question was never whether the technology works. The question is whether the economics of buying a new one in 2026 at full price without a subsidy, in a market with rising electricity costs, aggressive depreciation, and an inventory glut that tells you prices are likely to continue softening, makes financial sense for the average American buyer who drives 15,000 miles a year and plans to own the vehicle for 5 to 7 years. And the most rigorous annual cost of ownership study in the American automotive industry, published in September 2025 by an organization that has been running this analysis since 1950, says the answer is no. So what does the smart move look like right now? First, if you need a new vehicle in 2026 and you are considering an EV, run the full 5-year ownership cost calculation before you walk into a dealership. Not the fuel savings number, not the maintenance savings number, the full number, including depreciation, insurance, financing, and fees, using your actual electricity rate and the realistic resale value of the specific model you are considering. AAA's methodology exists precisely so you can do this, and their data for the specific vehicle categories is publicly available. Second, recognize that the brands that grew in this environment, Toyota, Cadillac, Lexus, did so largely by betting on hybrid technology rather than full battery electric, and there is a reason for that. A well-executed hybrid like the Toyota models that have been on the market for over 2 decades has a reliability track record, a repair ecosystem, and a depreciation curve that has been validated over hundreds of thousands of vehicles across millions of miles. That is not true yet for most full battery electric vehicles. Third, if you are tempted by the aggressive price cuts and incentives currently being used to clear the EV inventory glut, understand that an incentive offered because a manufacturer cannot sell a product at its intended price is not a deal. It is a signal. The market is telling you something about future resale values when it cannot clear the lot without stacking discounts. Fourth, if your situation allows it, wait. The EV market in 2026 is in structural reset. The technology is improving, the prices are softening, and the supply of used EVs coming off lease is growing rapidly, meaning the economics of buying a used EV in the next 12 to 24 months could be substantially more favorable than buying new today. The EV value proposition was always built on a math that required external support to work. That support is gone. The companies that built their strategies around it are writing down tens of billions of dollars to tell their shareholders exactly that. AAA's data is raising serious concerns for consumers who are about to make a decision worth $50,000 based on a financial story that stopped being accurate when the subsidy structure was removed. The market is not punishing electric vehicles because people do not want them. It is revealing, in real time, what they were always actually worth without the subsidy underneath them. That is not a technology failure. That is a financial architecture failure. And the people who designed that architecture are not the ones who will absorb the depreciation on your driveway. You are. If this is the kind of analysis you want more of, subscribe. New videos every week, and none of them will tell you what you want to hear. They will tell you what the data actually says.